Hi there, Jerry Visick here, and what I'm going to talk about in this video is a way of preparing a palette for mixing your acrylic paints. Uh, for any type of acrylic painting you're doing, this palette is really super useful. I'm going to use it for a demo in a video I do next about dry brush painting with acrylic paint. Dry brush painting, as it was taught to me by a lot of moons ago by a dear friend and great illustrator, Nathan Ota. This particular palette is not a palette per se, but rather it is a cookie sheet. You know, the one made in the last 30 years that is not stainless steel, but rather aluminum or something that's not going to rust. And so this is just a good sized cookie sheet. And sometimes when I'm painting, I'll have two of these, or one large one and one small one, because I'm actually going to mix my paints on top of this paper. So let's talk about how this is done. A little breeze blew on there. So there's a cookie sheet, and I use it exclusively for my palette. And I don't know what size that is. Looks like what, 15 by 12. Regardless, I have this cookie sheet, and then I lay paper towels down into the cookie sheet, and you want to make sure they're thicker than just one layer. Whatever type of paper towels you want to lay down is fine, but you want to cover the entire cookie sheet, baker's tray, whatever you want to call it. And when it is covered, you're going to take, now this you'll have to purchase, and you can purchase these by the sheet, or you can purchase these by the pack. And what this is designer's vellum. It's vellum paper, which is very high quality paper. The reason this is gridded is when I bought this pack, all they had was the gridded, but clear is great, Gridded paper is fun to play with for other reasons, especially when you're practicing technical perspective and such. But for our purposes, it doesn't matter whether it's gridded or there's nothing on it at all. I prefer nothing on it. So I have this piece of vellum that I cut to size to fit into my tray, exactly into my tray. We don't want any overhang. We want everything kind of tailor cut here. And the idea is, because this paper, this vellum, it's not wax paper, so don't use wax paper. That would be erroneous. This paper is porous. It has tiny pores in it. You can't see them, but tiny pores in it that will allow moisture to come through without the water coming through. So I've seen students try to use wax paper for this before, and it doesn't work because the moisture doesn't come through wax paper. So I have a water container here, and I'm going to pour, a generous amount of water. You don't want to pour too much because you don't want to flood it. And I'm going to let the water go around. I'm obviously going to need more because you want the entire bottom of your cookie tray, your baker's sheet, wet. But at the same time, you don't want it flooded. The trick is to get it all wet to all four corners. And if that takes a minute, that's fine. Maybe I need a little more. It's a particularly warm, dry day. And once it is wet, you have to keep it wet when you're painting. And that just involves every so often checking to make sure that your paper towels haven't dried up, and you pour a little more in. So you lay this vellum on top of your cookie sheet that has the wet paper towels underneath. And as long as these paper towels stay wet, any acrylic paint you put on top of your vellum that's resting on the cookie sheet, the paint will stay wet. The minute the paper towels become dry, or if one section of the paper towels become dry, whatever paint is on top of your vellum in that spot will become dry. So the thing about acrylic paint that is frustrating for so many people when they try using it, especially for the first time, is that it dries very quickly. And it's tough to mix because when you're painting with acrylic paint, when you're actually starting a painting, if you paint a spot on your canvas or on your illustration board, and that spot, the paint starts to dry, and you go to your palette and pick up some more paint, and start painting on that partially dry spot, you'll just create craters and holes. When I do a painting demo, I'll talk about that more. Also in this particular demo, I want to talk a little about color mixing and then once again, the importance of keeping these paper towels wet. Before I talk about the color mixing, if you pause and set this tray aside someplace, a couple of things, obviously, you want to make sure nobody gets to it, because if the paint, if it gets on clothing or gets on the floor, or if your cat walks on it, acrylic paint's nearly impossible to get out. And you might have a wonderfully spotted carpet, or a very, you may be very upset with your cat, whichever way you're going to look at it. So in cool weather, if I get these paper towels good and soaked, I can have paint sitting on these overnight, and when I wake up the next morning, if I want to continue painting, the paint will still be wet. And I'll probably add a little more water then. When the weather's really warm and dry, it's not a bad idea to cover your palette with a piece of plastic wrap and put it in your refrigerator. Tell everybody what it is. For one thing, it can be toxic, but for another thing, you don't want anybody going in there thinking it's some type of cake icing or something else, or putting things on top of it. Always be aware that other people may, go into your refrigerator, or a cat may walk on top of your palette. You always have to be aware of what could happen. Okay, so these paper towels are wet enough, and like I said, it is a warm day. So if I'm doing a painting, I'll probably wet them some more as time goes on. But I want to talk a little about mixing on this palette. This vellum, while it's great paper, it is at the same time it's somewhat fragile. So, I like mixing with a palette knife. It's a good idea to mix with a palette knife rather than your brushes for a number of reasons. But I like mixing with a palette knife, and you don't want to stab your vellum with the palette knife, because it'll cause holes to be in it. So when you are mixing, you want to mix with largely with the bottom and sides of your palette knife. I've got a couple of them here. These guys have been places. I love these knives. Palette knives, not only, are for mixing, artists have painted with these before. Cezanne and possibly Van Gogh actually created textures with these kind of knives in their paintings to create that beautiful pastel look, along with, lots of other artists. So the great thing about the palette knife is that it bends. You don't want to do this with a butter knife. You want to have something that's it's got a little bit of give to it, Okay, and then of course it has this nice bend to it, so you're not, the handle's not getting in your way. So I want to mix a blue, and I want to neutralize a blue. And what this is, so I don't have to mix this blue at all, because it's already cobalt blue. I like cobalt blue. It's one of my favorite colors. And this particular brand is Liquitex, which is one of my favorite acrylic brands. When you're buying acrylic paints or any paints, if you find a brand that works for you and you want to keep using it, that's great, because if I order another tube of this heavy body cobalt blue by Liquitex, I know exactly the product I'm getting. If I buy it by another manufacturer, it might be a good product, but whether it is or not, it might not be the same cobalt blue that Liquitex mixes. So when I put the paint onto the palette, let me open this. A little bit kind of goes a long way, you'd be surprised. But I want to put a little bit of this cobalt blue down. Now this cobalt blue, it's a dark blue. If you squint, it looks very dark compared to the somewhat white value of the vellum paper. But it's bright. So, in color theory and in its two-dimensional design class, you talk about value, which is light and dark, and chroma and intensity, which is bright and dull. So this may be a fairly dark blue, but it's a very bright blue. It's not dulled down at all. A more neutralized blue might be, the color of my shirt here. Of course, it's a lighter value too, but there's nothing bright about this blue. This is sort of a blue-gray. So, color mixing 101. One of the, basic things you want to understand about color mixing is to get a color less bright, to make it, neutralized, less intense, less bright, have less chroma, all of these synonyms you can use. You want to generally mix a color with its complement. So on the color wheel, when you go across from blue, there is orange. When I do demos in class, I like to stick with the primaries, generally red, blue, and yellow, to show students they don't have to break their bank to create a lot of beautiful colors from those three. Because those are a version of primaries, and you can make it secondaries and tertiaries from those. But I like to have a cad orange, which I would get from mixing this cadmium red and cadmium yellow together. But I like to have it handy because I like to use it specifically to neutralize my blue. Or if I want to have a nice orange and neutralize my orange, I'd use a little blue. So little is key. Let me try to open this. The reason a little bit so important is when I put this orange down here, if I put a little bit of orange into that blue, a little bit, it's going to make the blue a little less intense. Now that's important. It's going to make the blue a little less intense. If I put too much orange into the blue has you've no longer maintained the integrity of the blue. It starts to become neutralized. Now it might make a nice color, might make a nice earth tone. Many earth tones are made with combinations of blue and orange and red and green, etc. But it's no longer blue. So if the idea is to make your blue a little less bright, rather than canceling your blue out, a little bit at a time. You want to add a little bit at a time. So let's do that for a second here. I'm going to take just a dab of this orange here. And this is a lot of blue, but I'm going to use it in a little while, so I have a reason for having so much. And I'm going to mix it in there. And you want to mix thoroughly, guys. You don't want to have streaks in there. So mixing, I've heard it said before that some artists will spend more time actually mixing the colors they want than doing the actual painting. Because if you don't mix the colors you want, what happens is you have to mix them again. Or you end up with a painting that is different than what you'd originally anticipated, which is a bummer, Now this is turning into a different blue here. This is kind of a grayish blue. I quite like it. I want to do something here for just a second to show you. When I put this cobalt blue back down, you can see, I'll hold it up closer to the camera, you can see the intensity of that pure cobalt blue, compared to this neutralized blue that I added a little bit of orange to. So what happens inadvertently when we're, neutralizing colors? They will either get, a lot of times, a little darker than they already were, or they'll be as dark as they were before. Sometimes they'll get a little lighter, but it's case by case. So by changing the intensity, the chroma, the brightness of that blue, and turning it into, a little bit of a different blue here, I've taken away from the brightness. It's no longer attacking our retinas. That bright blue can be like wah, 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 into your retinas, where this other blue is a little more comforting. If that blue is too neutralized, you can add a little more cobalt back into it. But the point I'm trying to make is, a little while ago I talked about there's value, which is light, dark, and middle tones, everything in between. And then there's brightness, chroma, intensity. All three of those words are used for the same thing. Brightness, chroma, intensity means how bright is the color, or how neutralized is the color. This blue was very, very bright when it came out of the tube. I neutralized it by adding a little orange. And you can neutralize it all the way to where it's neither blue nor orange. It's just, it becomes an earth tone, a neutral color. So while changing the intensity of a color can affect its value, remember value is light and dark. If you get the neutralized color you wish, that you want to begin with, and you want to lighten it, there's different ways of doing it, but you can use white paint. Now in this case, because I'm going to mix up a batch of this, generally when you're mixing, when you're painting with acrylic, you want to paint, this is a different brand, but this is good white acrylic paint. Generally when you're painting, you want to use acrylic paint, but gesso is used for sealing canvases, and you can use it to extend the color. So I'm going to put a little bit of this over here, and how much, I don't know how much I'm going to need, but I'm going to use that white just for this blue, so I can go ahead and get a dab of this and put it in here, and then I can mix it completely until you get the blue you're looking for. If you add too much of the the orange to the blue to neutralize it, or if you add too much of the white to the neutralized blue to lighten it, am I losing you guys? Then you've got a whole bunch of color you don't want to use, So it's always it's important to add a little at a time. It's important to add a little bit at a time instead of a whole bunch. If you get a mix of color that you're not going to use, you could probably salvage it by scraping some to the side and adding back in what colors it needed. But now you're seeing we're starting to get this nice, I like it, this nice sort of, neutralized, lighter than that blue. I want a little more white. But still, not super light. What I'm attempting to create here is a really, really nice mid-tone. You'll see why when I demo this painting in a little while. I'm trying to create a real nice mid-tone and a real nice color to use in my painting anyway. So you mix and you mix, because like I said, you don't want streaks. I mean, if you're going for streaks for whatever reason, that's one thing. But when you're trying to get a solid color, you really want to mix, and then sometimes I'll use my other palette knife and scrape off the excess. And, you get the paint off your palette knife at some point. I think this one has a little bit of impasto built up on it. You can use anything to scrape the paint off a palette knife, and then you set everything someplace safe. I'm wearing, let me say, less than expensive clothes. Not that I'm a clothes horse to begin with, but I have a shirt on that is, if I put the sleeve up here again, you can see there's a lot of paint in it, because I don't care if this shirt gets paint on it, because it is a shirt I put on to paint with. Whether I'm painting walls in my home or I'm doing a painting, I put this shirt on. Because if this stuff gets in your clothes, if you're wearing something that means a lot to you, something expensive, high quality, garment, and the acrylic gets in it, maybe you can clean it out if you do it immediately, but you probably ruined it. Okay, so there is a nice mixed neutralized blue. Let me carefully hold this up to the camera a little better. And I've still got plenty of palette to mix other colors on. This blue, you'll see what I'm going to do in the demo in a while. I'm going to cover a surface with it. This blue is ready to go, and then when I want to start mixing other colors that I'm going to put into my painting in a while, I've got room here in my palette. Once again, make sure these paper towels stay wet. That batch of blue will stay wet overnight if your paper towels are wet overnight, because if you tried to mix that blue the next morning or 2 days later and try to remember exactly what the mathematical equation of the 3 colors I put in there was, you'd probably go crazy before you got it right. So keeping the paint that you mix wet is important. You can also put pre-mixed paint, make paint that you mixed into film canisters or any type of little airtight plastic container, and it'll stay wet in those for a long time as well. So if you're mixing a good chunk of paint, you're going to paint on a larger surface, an airtight plastic container. Try to keep it in a cool place somewhere, so it stays wet even longer. But I've opened canisters of acrylic paint that I mixed a week later, and they were still wet. Working out of the palette though, you want to do this. I can't emphasize strongly enough, guys, wet paper towels. You know, every so often, doesn't hurt to lift up and pour a little more in. Remember never to flood, because if you flood, then the water is going to come out and get into your paint itself, okay? And unless you want to get your paint watered down, that's kind of a bummer. And then to recap, this is a cookie sheet. Those are just paper towels from Costco. This is a sheet of vellum. The vellum's very important, guys, because if you use wax paper, it won't work. And then I mix the paint on top. They do sell palettes that have paper that may be similar to vellum, where you get this round palette with a sponge inside of it, and then you can have this mixing paper on top of it. I don't find those, I haven't found one yet that's higher quality as this do-it-yourself palette. So next video will be where I'm actually using paint from this palette to create a painting. And when I do that, I've got a collection of brushes here I'm going to paint with, because I'll be doing a dry brush acrylic painting. And we'll talk about those more when I do that. Okay, thank you.